Seeds of Revolution, Part 1 of the American Revolution, Table of Contents, Taxation without Representation, and Acts of Frustration and Retaliation. Taxation without Representation. In 1764, just a year after the Treaty of Paris, Britain's Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which taxed Spanish and French molasses and sugar bought by colonists. The cheap Spanish and French sugar that colonists had been buying was now so expensive that they had to buy British sugar. This made money that Britain could use to pay off its war debts. In 1765, Britain's Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which called for colonists to house the 10,000 British troops still in America after the French and Indian War in their private homes. Britain's soldiers lived with colonists and were not required to pay rent or help the family in any way. But it was the Stamp Act, passed that same year, that really raised an outcry from the colonists. The act required colonists to buy a British stamp for the printed paper they used, which meant they would pay taxes on newspapers, calendars, playing cards, and other paper items. The colonists were not happy about being taxed. They complained most loudly about the fact that they had no voice in the government that taxed them. Colonists' fury led to cries of no taxation without representation. They wanted someone in Parliament to speak for them, but King George did not like colonists telling him what he should do. While he was thinking of how to retaliate against the rebellious colonists, the colonists began working together to fight the taxes. Over the years, colonists had developed ways of ruling themselves. In Virginia, an elected assembly set laws for the colony. This elected assembly argued over the Stamp Act's fairness. Patrick Henry, a young lawyer, stood and announced that no one except Virginians had the right to tax Virginians. The assembly accepted Henry's position, even though some called Henry a traitor for speaking out against King George. Newspapers reported Henry's position, and soon people throughout the 13 colonies were protesting the Stamp Act. James Otis and Samuel Adams joined Henry as just a few of the leaders speaking out against the tax. Colonists like Adams, Henry, and Otis were called patriots. Colonists who supported King George were called loyalists. Some of the patriots formed groups called the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty and urged colonists to refuse to trade with or buy goods from the British. Some British stamp agents were even attacked by colonists. More acts from Britain's Parliament were to come, as were more attacks. In October 1765, 9 colonies out of 13 sent representatives to New York to take part in the Stamp Act Congress. The Congress asked Britain's Parliament to repeal or cancel the Stamp Act. In 1766, King George agreed to repeal the Stamp Act. But in 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed. The Townshend Acts put taxes on glass, paint, lead, paper, and tea. Colonists raged against the new taxes. They boycotted or refused to buy British goods. In 1770, Britain repealed all but one of the Townshend Acts because its merchants were losing money. Tension between the Patriots and Britain were building. British soldiers spread across the colonies to enforce the taxes. More taxes brought more resentment. One night in Boston, the tension and resentment brought more violence. Of frustration and retaliation. Large numbers of British soldiers had lived fairly peacefully in Boston after the French and Indian War. Colonists resented the soldiers, but for years they managed to live side by side. On the night of March 5, 1770, a group of rowdy Boston colonists picked a fight with some British soldiers. One thing led to another, and the soldiers began to shoot. The soldiers killed 5 colonists. Patriot Samuel Adams saw the fight in Boston as a way to get more colonists on the side of independence. He asked his friend Paul Revere, a silversmith, to engrave a picture of what happened in Boston. Adams called the fight started by colonists the Boston Massacre. The engraved picture, which showed British soldiers firing into a group of peaceful colonists, was printed in newspapers and other places. The picture was not a true account of events, but it gave Adams the result he wanted. The picture enraged many colonists. In 1773, all that was left of the Townshend Acts was a tax on tea. The Tea Act required colonists to buy tea only from Britain's East India Company. The colonists were still not represented in Parliament, and they were angry that not all of the taxes were repealed. A group of frustrated colonists showed their dislike for the tea tax. They climbed aboard a British ship and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. They dressed up as Native Americans so they could not be blamed for the trouble they caused. However, the British were neither fooled nor amused. The act became known as the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, King George and Parliament retaliated with the Coercive Acts, which the colonists renamed the Intolerable Acts. These acts were written to punish the rebellious colonists. One of the acts closed Boston Harbor to all ship traffic. They put many Boston colonists out of work and made them worry that they would starve. Colonists in other areas felt sorry for Boston and were furious with Britain. In the meantime, Britain appointed General Thomas Gage as governor of Massachusetts and sent him to Boston to take control of the city. Gage brought 4,000 troops with him, which the colonists then had to house and feed. Like the Stamp Act that came before it, the Intolerable Acts united colonists against Britain. In September 1774, 12 colonies sent delegates or representatives to Philadelphia to meet in the First Continental Congress. The delegates insisted the Intolerable Acts be repealed. They also insisted that colonists have a say in all tax laws. Britain's Parliament refused the demands of the First Continental Congress and declared the colonies to be in a state of mutiny. The delegates of the Continental Congress urged colonists in Massachusetts to gather weapons and stop all trade with Britain. The Continental Congress started to train soldiers, known as militiamen or minutemen, for the fight ahead. American colonists were preparing to fight for independence from a country that many no longer believed or trusted.